Okay, it is time for Chapter 4, American Life in the 17th Century. And the major idea of this chapter is looking at the culture and politics and other things of the colonies leading up to the turn of the century, the 1700s. So we'll start with the Chesapeake colonies, which are both Virginia and Maryland. If you lived in Virginia and Maryland, it was a very rough life for a long time. Nearly half of the people who lived in the Chesapeake Bay died before the age of 20, much of that due to the various diseases, such as malaria, dysentery, and typhoid. Most settlers who lived in that area were single men and died soon after their arrival. Sadly, for many of the men that were there, the male female ratio was 6 to 1, so there were very few families. The marriages that did exist were destroyed by death, as you can tell by that extreme early death age for most people living there. Mostly single parent households existed, with many of the pregnancies out there being unmarried women. Somehow, despite all of these deaths, the colony is able to fight on, and by 1700 the white population increased without the aid of immigration. In other words, they steadied their ability to handle the diseases. The farmland probably plowed over the various swamps and areas that created a lot of the diseases and ill health, and so their population was able to grow naturally without immigrants coming in. Uh, as far as the economy of the Chesapeake colonies, it relied almost solely upon tobacco. Sadly, tobacco is a very, I guess you could say, destructive crop. It exhausts all the soil and absorbs all of the nutrients there. And because they relied on it completely for their economy, they couldn't just let the fields lie fallow without any crops growing to allow those nutrients to replenish themselves. So, because of that, the commercial growers would constantly buy up the land around their farms, uh, creating sprawling plantations by pushing the other farmers up river valleys. As those smaller farmers were forced further out from the coast, they would provoke Indian attacks as they infringed upon their land. As those farmers also get pushed further out, and as plantations grew and more tobacco was grown, labor was needed, but of course those challenges persisted. The natural population, because of the aforementioned diseases, grew too slowly. Native Americans died or were able to escape and uh, basically join other Indian tribes, and slaves at that point were way too expensive. So, to encourage the growth of the population and the labor force, Virginia and Maryland created the headright system. This meant that if you paid for the passage of indentured servants to come to America and work, they gave you 50 additional acres. Now, yes, this did bring in a lot of people who were able to come to America and start a new life. What this really did is give even more land and economic power to those who already owned a lot of that property. So the headright system did help the colonies grow, but also gave power to those economic elites. So indentured servants grow frustrated over time. The textbook calls them white slaves because they were treated very poorly when they got here. Because they were temporary workers, they were used and abused as such. And if they were to perish, that was no problem for the landowners, as they would simply purchase another slave's passage or another immigrant's passage, so that the indentured servant could work for the additional 17 years, and they would get 50 acres. So these indentured servants would work for 7 to 10 years to be free, and when they were done, they were supposed to receive land. Now, that did not always occur because land was running short and they ran out of space. And so many of those indentured servants who worked their entire contract didn't receive the land. And many of them would even return to work for their former master at low wages. Others would go towards the frontier, which created its own issues with Native Americans. So those men who did not receive the land and those who were free also couldn't find single women. So not only are you economically stunted, but you also don't have that kind of social ability to create a family. In the 1670s, now they also had their political abilities hindered because the House of Burgesses disenfranchised those who did not own land. So you had to own land in order to vote. If you did not own land, you also had very low economic power, and then you also have the inability to start a family. So these former servants being pushed further and further out and further weakened politically and economically were frustrated because they also had to fight Native Americans as they tried to gain land on the frontier. Which brings us to Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. So with all those frustrations mentioned, it is finally reaches a head between those former indentured servants and poor landless whites and the aristocracy when Governor Berkeley refuses to retaliate against Indian attacks on the frontier. Because he did not react, a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who actually was a fairly wealthy landowner toward the frontier, he's able to rally the small farmers and landless whites against what they called the planter aristocracy or coastal elites. Basically, they said that their tax money, which was being raised, was not being used for something that they wanted, which was protection against Native Americans. And of course, they also have those other social and political frustrations. So when Berkeley basically ignores Bacon and those farmers' demands, and he says that they need to stand down, Bacon's army attacks Native Americans, and then they lead a march on Jamestown, setting it on fire. His rebellion falls apart when he dies of dysentery as Berkeley prepares to attack. But so the major thing that happens from this, so the rebellion itself falters when Bacon dies, and they don't really get any of those changes. But what plantation owners realize is it's not worthwhile bringing in more indentured servants, because once their indenture is over and they don't get the land they want, you have a population which is frustrated towards their situation in life. So Bacon's rebellion causes them to look away from indentured servant and look towards slavery so that they have less troublesome labor. This map shows you the amount of slaves which come over from Africa and are imported against their will. You see that the majority actually go towards South America and the Caribbean, with only about 360,000 coming to the Americas. With that said, that does not mean that the slaves were treated any worse or better. Of course, this is just showing that more went to those other regions. So as colonial slavery grew, only about 400,000 of those 7 million come to North America, with most of them coming after 1700. As you can tell, in 1670, only 7% of the southern population was made up of slavery, but it's after Bacon's rebellion that they begin importing them in larger numbers. Most colonists could not afford the high prices for slaves, so although slaves were certainly being brought in higher numbers, they were being purchased by a small number of people. In fact, if we fast forward all the way to the 1850s, only about 25% of Southerners or white Southerners owned slaves. So 75% were without slaves because they were still expensive. Servants cost less than slaves, but Bacon had made them undesirable, and so we see that massive amount being brought in. In 1698, this also helps boost the slave trade because the Royal African Company, which was a British company, loses its crown-mandated monopoly on the slave trade, so Americans begin to dominate the business. Rhode Island, who we had mentioned, was kind of an arbiter of the early American values of religious freedom and treating people equally. Certainly takes a step back as that state begins to dominate the business of the slave trade. The saddest part of the slave trade was the Middle Passage, in which they were packed in like basically cattle or pack animals, and 15% of the passengers coming from Africa to the New World died on that trip. Sadly, that did not stop them from bringing them in. It only made them cram even more into those ships, as you can see here, because even if 15% died, if you crammed as many as you could in those ships, well, you would still make a good profit. So sadly for humankind, and especially American slaves, we continue to bring them over and enslave them. And this is another depiction of their lives there. So slave codes get drilled into law beginning the 1660s. If you remember the Barbados Slave Code from an earlier chapter, those codes had been created in the Caribbean in order to make sure that slave rebellions were limited and slaves knew their place, that they could be controlled and even killed without any consequence for the slave owner. So those laws had actually not really been in place until the 1660s. In fact, many slaves could earn manumission or freedom, and many former slaves even purchased servants or slaves for themselves. It's not until after Bacon's Rebellion and these laws get more stringent and codified that we see slaves being marked as property. You see that term there, it's called chattel slavery because that means that they are treated like cattle. In other words, property by their owners. Not even conversion granted freedom. Early on in American history, if you converted a slave, many Americans had felt that that was kind of a violation of Christianity. What they do is they actually pass a law that says that if you convert them, they can stay slaves. That way, they kind of soothe their conscience and make it acceptable to enslave them. So the sad part of the codification of slavery, you can see there as well, they can't teach a slave to read or write. The sad part of this system is that it turns into a racial system because one major reason slavery was handed down by the woman, because white men who owned slaves would sleep with their slave women and have children, but they didn't want those children to be able to be free, because then you would have a mixed race that wouldn't have a marked difference. It would kind of blur the lines and give humanity to the slaves that were predominantly, or well, almost 100% African. So when they said that women were the way that you would determine a child's slave status, they really uh, kind of, I guess you'd say, bunkered down on making sure that black men could not sleep with white women. And we see the effects of that socially and politically all the way into the 1900s. And some would even say today that mixed couples have some social issues or discrimination, but certainly that is prevailing attitude. And that really begins developing back in the 1600s and into the 1700s, when we really codify slavery and begin drawing a distinctive line between blacks and whites through these laws. So, without getting into too many details about these slave rebellions, each of these slave rebellions led to more restrictions on the slaves that lived in that city. In the New York Slave Revolt, slaves had been allowed to travel around. They would be given chores in the morning, go about town and do your business. And that allowed for them to kind of meet together and make plans. And, well, they accused that of being a reason for the slave revolt. And so we see large restrictions put on slaves there. In the Sono Rebellion, the South had not completely uh, set a lot of restrictions on slaves. So after the Stono Rebellion of 1739, they passed further laws. As we'll cover in later slave rebellions in future chapters, you have Gabriel Prosser, who was a blacksmith. And because of his skills, he went around from plantation to plantation being used for his abilities. But that enabled him to create a network which created a conspiracy for a massive multi-plantation slave rebellion. So after they bust his plot and execute him, they then say that slaves can't travel from plantation to plantation. Then finally you have Nat Turner, who was a preacher. Because he used his church service, which was made up only of the slaves on the plantation, because he used that church service to rally the slaves and use them to create a slave rebellion, they decide to no longer allow slaves to meet without white people present. So we just see that, unfortunately for slave rebellions, they aren't successful, and it leads to just further restrictions on their lives as slaves. So these are specific ways that slave laws continue to restrict their freedoms and make life worse for slaves as time passed. Now we look at the overall structure of Southern society from top to bottom. You have a very powerful planter class dominating. They're your plantation owners, and as Bacon's rebellion called them, the planter elite or planter aristocracy, all living on the coast in the best land. So they are at the very top of the hierarchy, making up nearly 70% of the Virginia legislature. You may recognize names like Lee, like from the Robert E. Lee family, or the Fitzhughs, who had one of the first governors of Virginia, and of course Washington being the family of George Washington. So you have these first families of Virginia dominating the politics and economy of the South. Beneath them in that hierarchy are small farmers. And this is the largest social group because you have a lot of small farmers. They may or may not own slaves, but they're able to make a living on their own, a modest living, and survive that way. Beneath them are the landless whites, who may have come over as indentured servants, but they're basically people who worked for other landowners, and then indentured servants beneath them because they don't really have any freedoms or rights until they finish their contract. Then at the bottom of the social hierarchy, we have slaves, looked down upon by even the lowliest, uneducated whites. It gave whites, those poor whites, an ability to look at themselves and say that they are better off and better than those slaves. So again, we have a way that blacks become looked down upon socially because of their status. And one reason why whites unfortunately defend it moving forward or defend slavery is because it did give them that ability to say, hey, at least I'm not at the bottom. Furthermore, owning slaves would be a social status marker. And if you were able to own slaves, you had basically made it in life. And so they wanted to keep slavery around because it was a way for them to mark how they were successful. So again, Southern society, plantation owners are at the top, followed by small farmers, then landless whites, indentured servants, and finally slaves at the very bottom. Other Southern societal facts: very few cities sprout around the colonial South due to the isolated, sprawling plantations. This also leads to very little education as cities were too spread out. That lack of education means you don't have professional classes develop, including your typical educated group of lawyers, doctors, and financiers. They don't develop without cities, just because there's not a collected group to use their skills or the education to help them develop. And then finally, roads were very treacherous in the South, which isn't very, I guess you could say, surprising, considering there wasn't exactly the technology to make good roads out in those kind of foresty farmlands. And so waterways became the primary means of transportation and shipping in the South. So that summarizes most of what we see in the South, and they are very directly, I guess, contrasted by New England. New England had very rocky soil and a harsh weather. And not only did that shape their culture, it also meant that they would not grow cash crops. Their climate and soil simply made that impossible. So although the majority of settlers were farmers, what they did is they engaged in subsistence farming, which basically means that they grow what they need to survive. This also means that slavery was not as popular in New England because you didn't need a large labor force to keep your farming going. Instead, what they focused upon was shipping, and shipping would use a lot of things. They had molasses that would be pulled from trees in that region. You also have lumber being chopped down to feed the growing British Navy. You have fishing, the codfish around the Newfoundland Bay. And then you have, of course, just general shipping of goods and other natural resources that America had that Britain and other nations had a high demand for. You also have the belief that this is God's chosen people. Going back to John Winthrop and his belief that they are a city on a hill, that idea really permeated across America as they spread west. And as we look at things like manifest destiny, and we look today at the idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that we are a chosen and special people that are an exception to the rest of the people in the world really comes from this New England belief of being God's chosen people. You don't see that idea in the South as much, although as time passes and these people mingle on the frontier, the idea of American exceptionalism certainly does spread. As far as life in New England, again, you have a superior life in how long they live. They add 10 years of their life just by living in New England. So if you moved from London in that condensed city, you would add 10 years to your life. The average life of the first generation of Puritans here, once they built their settlements and survived their first few winters, their lifespan grew to being nearly 70 years. So you can see if living a long time is your preference, New England was certainly better. They also tended to migrate as a family, rather than the men who came here to have their own farms or initially were thinking they were going to be miners. Families were the center of society in New England. They got married when they were young, and they pushed out a lot of babies, with the average woman giving birth to 10 children in their lifetime and raising 8. Because of their long lifespan and their early birth rates and marriage rates, New England is given credit by the textbook as inventing grandparents because many generations would be there. So, as far as the women who lived in New England, they did not have many property rights. That's because, I suppose, looking from a biblical lens, the man was the leader of the household, and it was easier to track property through him. So, when women got married, they actually gave up their legal rights, and that's including the right of owning property. So, women could also not vote in this area, even if they were a visible saint and been baptized and added. But authorities could intervene if they were being mistreated. So, they weren't men's property per se, but they certainly didn't have very many rights. Their only really area of authority would be midwifery. In other words, handling all that birthing and all the babies growing up. Divorce was also rare in this area, as they were very family focused, and the Bible says specifically God hates divorce. So when couples tried to separate, they could actually be forced to reunite by authorities. So by modern views of marriage and women's rights in marriage and ability to fight against abuse and also have rights, women were not exactly in, at least from a modern lens, a very good place in New England. So New England was a very tightly knit society, which once again is a contrast to the South, which was very spread out. Instead, cities were very planned. What they would do is they would center the town around a church. The church would be built, and then they would build the village around it with a village green where militia could drill and prepare themselves. Around that little village, every family received parcels of land. Once your village reached 50 families, the colony required you to provide elementary education. Now, you may think, wow, they sure are progressive, but really what it came down to is they wanted their children to know the Bible. You had to, in order to be a good Christian, you have to be literate and able to read and understand the Bible, which is also why they're the first to develop secondary education, or, well, I guess higher education. Harvard was founded in 1636, but not in order to provide better professionals. Rather, it was there to train ministers to better understand the Bible, and as more villages were created, provide ministers for their spreading and growing society. So you can see all throughout there, going back to that first line, The shared Puritan beliefs created a unity and moral concern for all these people. The religion was the center of their society, and that also enabled them to center it around the family as well. One more thing to touch on is the idea of congregational churches. So every single church was autonomous. You did not have a pope figure or you did not have a board which would decide what each church believed or practiced. And so each congregation was autonomous with the minister and the elders there deciding what rules they would follow. Now, this leads to disagreements, which would then lead to more churches. But it certainly did lead to the idea that they have control over what they believe and what they practice. And so we see a large belief in democracy in their not only their church lives, but also spreading into their political life, which led to town meetings. Elected officials would come together to decide their tax rates, how their money was used, how their militia was used. And so we have from the very beginning in New England society a very democratic and self-representative government forming. So getting on to that religious idea, their reason for coming over here in New England was certainly centered around religion. But over time, after that first generation passed, the religious zeal died down. Church leaders began to become alarmed because their people were more concerned with making money, with going out there and chopping down lumber or fishing or fur trapping. And because of that, they said, we need to bring more people in. Now, what they found is their doomsayer sermons, or basically hellfire and brimstone, was not working. Neither was the lack of voting rights that they provided to people. If you remember, you had to be a member of the church in order to receive voting rights early on, and they continued to not give many people that ability to vote. And so because you also had to have the visible experience to become a church member, church membership became unattainable. And so a lot of people refused to join the church, and they lost their passion of attending services if they couldn't become members. So that led to leaders of the church and New England society coming up with something called the Halfway Covenant. They allowed the baptized children of visible saints to become church members without that visible experience. They would be baptized, they would have to attend, but now this opens up the door for a lot more people becoming members. Over time, this led to a purely open membership. So the early on religious purity that the quote Puritans wanted ends up being sacrificed so that more people will attend church. Did this work? Well, as we'll see in the next couple of chapters, there's a movement called the First Great Awakening. And they have to not only adapt how people become church members, they also end up having to adapt the way that they preached. But that's for a future lesson. What I want you to understand is societally, and it's not only a religious thing, people want more people to have that passion to stay involved. So churches today do the same thing in relaxing their overall, quote, religious purity so that more people can come and join. Now, building on that idea of religious purity and making sure people are following the word as expected, we have the Salem witch trials of 1692. This famous event is not a surprise because witchcraft persecutions had been common in Europe. However, this is the one major instance in America in which a witch hunt turns into a colony-wide, witch hunt. In Salem, Massachusetts, a group of girls claimed to have been bewitched. They had been having seizures, and so their parents wanted to figure out what was happening. They go to a doctor who prescribes them not with seizures or any kind of medical malady. Rather, he says that you have been bewitched. Those girls agree, and so they begin hunting for the source of it. As they go from their servant, Tituba, to two other women who were outcast of their society. One was a widow, and the other was a homeless woman who had to beg for money. Those three outcasts are first accused of being witches. Tituba then begins naming names, and eventually this leads to 19 people and, yes, sadly, 2 dogs being hanged. One person is also pressed to death, which is basically where you stack big rocks until he confesses. If he doesn't confess, he gets, well, crushed to death. Eventually, the governor realizes that it's gone too far, especially since his wife ends up being implicated and accused of being a witch. When that occurs, he ends the trials in 1693. So what does this reveal about Salem's and overall New England society? Well, they were very religiously superstitious. They believed God was involved in every facet of their life. And unfortunately, because of that, any bad thing that occurred must be God or probably the devil's fault. So what exactly caused them to go from being religious purists and just zealous people to suddenly wanting their neighbors basically executed because of their religious beliefs and fears? Well, some say that it's the Indian War giving them kind of almost like a PTSD. The trauma suffered by people on the frontier. They also had people rushing from the frontier and from a previous war with the French on the frontier. You had outsiders coming to these towns, and that caused a social and religious upheaval, or at least some tensions. You also have widening social stratification. What you see is initially you have people accusing outcasts like Tituba or a poor woman or a widow, those outside the norm of society being accused. But then over time, you see those women accusing those who are higher up. In fact, two of the women who ended up dying were leaders of the community and the church, two well-to-do women who previously had been thought of as good Christians and good people. So you have this difference between the social classes fighting. The book also mentions rising consumerism. There's no really good way to tell what the exact cause is. Honestly, you can probably boil it down just that superstition and the many other facets of their lives, just causing them to believe God and the devil being involved meant that certainly these seizures were the cause of something supernatural. Regardless, many people died, and luckily, at least I'd like to think, we have developed a lot since then. This brings us to the last slide and last idea of the early colonial society, and this is class warfare. So most white migrants came from neither the richest nor poorest classes of Europe. When they get here, they expect their lives to be kind of a second chance. And frontier life really did limit the ability of classes to develop. What happens over time, however, is you have the wealthy wanting to create a very stratified society where the rich are above the rest. Elites try to recreate the old world social structure. If you remember Maryland, Maryland was created by Lord Baltimore, and yes, he wanted freedom to worship for Catholics, but he also wanted to create a feudal society where the wealthy plantation owners had serfs, or basically servants, who did all the work for them. However, the people who migrated over here expecting a new start in life very strongly and successfully resisted their attempt, or the wealthy's attempt, to create that old social structure. Another case stacking on top of Bacon's rebellion is Leisler's rebellion. When the New England Dominion fell apart and King William and Mary overthrew the king back in England, Leisler leads the more, I guess you could say, working class against the wealthy merchants who had dominated. Just like the House of Burgesses was dominated by plantation owners in Virginia and Maryland, so you also have wealthy merchant class dominating politics in New York. And so Leisler leads the more working class people against them in this rebellion. Just like Bacon, sadly, he ends up dying. Unlike Bacon, he does not die of dysentery. Rather, he is executed for treason. So what this simply represents is that you have the rich versus the poor. In the South, you have the planter aristocracy or coastal elites trying to maintain control over small farmers or former indentured servants and landless whites. In the North, you have the hard-working class trying to overcome the wealthy merchants. Regardless, you have an ongoing struggle between the classes as they vie for control over the politics and future of their colonies. So this wraps up Chapter 4. You've actually already done that Middle Colonies activity, so don't worry about that. This wraps up Chapter 4. If you have any questions, please let me know. The key question videos are out there for you to complete, so hopefully that helps guide you. But again, if you have any questions, just send me a message.